So, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, Islam began as something strange and will return to being strange. So blessed are the strangers. These strangers today can be seen as the thinkers who are considering what it means to be Muslim. They include Ibrahim Musa, Abdul Karim Suruj, Ziba Mir Husseini, who are rethinking Islamic theology, ethics, law, and practice in the face of our contemporary challenges. In his book on a number of these thinkers, The Imperatives of Progressive Islam, Adis names the call towards a progressive Islam an imperative. And I think it's a great choice of word that he's used there. Being a progressive Muslim is an assertion for Adis that as stewards of God's creation, Muslims have the responsibility to act justly and fight for justice, even if it's against their own self-interest. This is a theme that runs throughout all of his work, including his new work on women in Islam, or women's issues within in Islam. Adis is a senior lecturer in Islam and Society at Griffith University. Originally from Bosnia, he received his PhD in 2010 from UWA on contemporary Islamic hermeneutics with special reference to progressive Islam and Salafism. He's the author of many, many books, among them Constructing Religious Ideal Believer and Muslim Woman Concepts, Maqasid al-Sharia and Contemporary Muslim Reformist Thought, The Sunnah and its Status in Islamic Law, the book that we are discussing today, The Imperatives of Progressive Islam, and Islam and Muslims in the West, which he co-authored, and also Islam and Gender, Major Issues and Debates, as well as many, many numerous academic articles, chapters, and encyclopedia entries. And many of these are available for free on the Academia Griffiths website. We will hear Adis discuss why it's important for Muslims to call themselves progressive. Adis will talk for about 20 to 30 minutes. And we will have a longer discussion moderated by myself and Faraz. So basically, I'll pass the mic now to Faraz, and Faraz will, give us a little brief about housekeeping matters. Thanks, Faraz.
Thank you, Iqbal. First, I wanted to just welcome and thank Adis for being with us here today. So just some very basic housekeeping rules. So everyone is going to be on mute except for our speaker, and he will deliver a talk. And at the end of that talk, we'll welcome some questions. So either you can type the questions in the chat box on the right side, and I will read them out, or feel free to raise your hand in the video, and then once once someone stops speaking, then I will unmute you, and then you can ask the question, and then again mute yourself, and then so that's the sort of the chain we'll follow. All right, then. Thanks everyone for being here, and we'll start.
Okay, thank you. And Adis, hand the mic over to you now. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Can I be heard? Wonderful. Before I start, I would like to express my deep thanks to the Muslim Collective and Dr. Iqbal Barakat and the team for initiating this seminar and for inviting me to be part of it. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why be a progressive Muslim issue. I wasn't quite sure how to approach the question and have decided to really do a summary of my Imperatives of Progressive Islam book, and through that lens explain why and in what ways we as Muslims should adopt an approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition from a progressive perspective, and I will explain what that progressive perspective actually means. So most of the content comes from that book that was published in 2017, The Imperatives of Progressive Islam, but I have added a couple of more ideas, some further reflections that supplement what's in the book based on my continued exposure to ideas that I consider relevant to this very question of what it means to be a progressive Muslim. What does progressive Islam mean? What does it entail? What are its components, constituent components? So yes, so let me then start, and I believe I'm sharing the screen with everyone else. I'm just trying to make it into a this doesn't seem to be working as well. Can everyone see? Can everyone see the? Hopefully, my writing is big enough in this format. Yeah. All right. Because if I make it into a like proper slideshow, it seems not to be showing all the words. All right. So I have, the word progressive Islam in many ways has taken off, and an increasing number of people have started to discuss progressive Islam, progressive Muslim thought. And as much as I welcome this, at times, and we are all guilty of this, whenever we use any concept, we don't always have the luxury or the time to really think deeply as to what this concept means, what it entails. And often that concept can be perhaps sometimes used in a less systematic or less thought out way, and might not necessarily reflect kind of the way I have tried to theorize the concept. So it's important that me to say that while I know I don't consider myself as having some kind of a monopoly on this concept in any sense, it is important to me that I present and discuss the concept from the perspective that I have invested quite a bit of my academic life into. So that does not mean that other people who are using the word progressive Islam necessarily approach it from the same angle. But what is important to me is that this concept is given enough attention conceptually, and that it is presented in a theoretically rigorous manner, because often, for one reason or another, we have our various intellectual opponents are going to abuse this concept by giving it its own interpretation that is not really based on any systematic theoretical kind of reflection, and it is not based on an actual academic theory of progressive Islam as such. So and because the concept became popularized and became more widely disseminated and diffused, and often this nuance gets lost. And I'm not blaming anyone, obviously. As I said, academic discussions and conceptualizations of any concept can only and properly, I guess, happen in academic settings, and we cannot expect people to discuss this concept deeply on social media or other platforms. Nonetheless, I think it is important that, given that the theory already exists, that we do become aware of all the dimensions and and the actual nature and the scope of this concept. So that this is what I will try to do. I will try to present the main elements of how I see and how I have theorized progressive Islam, of course, standing on the shoulders of other individuals and scholars. And then, as I discuss each component, perhaps I will discuss this idea of, well, why is this important to us as Muslims living in the 21st century? Why should we care about, or why does this make sense to us? Yeah. So if we look at the first slide, I have delineated essentially 8 facets or dimensions of what the academic theory of progressive Islam is and how it approaches the concept of progressive Islam. Yeah. I'm going to look at, as I said, in each one of them in a little bit more detail, not a lot of detail, and then perhaps add a few comments with respect to the question that we are discussing as to why should we approach Islam from this perspective. All right, so let's look at the first one. All right. So as you can see, the first element of progressive Islam revolves around this idea of essentially departing from certain tendencies in the Islamic intellectual tradition that are essentially more or less dogmatic and lack an element of critical, creative thought. Yeah. So when we look at all of these 8 elements of the way I have approached theorizing progressive Islam, in many ways they are a response to the more dominant approaches to the Islamic tradition, and kind of situating and the progressive Islam that I have tried to develop theoretically often situates itself in relation to these existing tendencies, and in many ways it's either a continuation or a discontinuation of certain approaches to the Islamic intellectual tradition that have always been made. Yeah. So the first element is all about this idea that when we look at the Islamic intellectual tradition, we should approach it always from this, like in an open-ended manner. We should approach it from the, epistemologically, it should not be based upon what, it should depart from these dominant trends that are embedded in this, that are epistemologically foreclosed and that are essentially still operating within a pre-modern epistemological framework. Yeah, and so apart from the fact that that progressive Islam is open to modern sources of knowledge, modern sources of modern discourses, progressive Islam also insists upon this idea of methodological pluralism. Again, as a reaction to the fact that the prevalent, more mainstream approaches to the Islamic tradition strongly let's say, limited in terms of the kinds of methodologies that they consider to be valid when it comes to interpreting the Islamic intellectual tradition. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that any approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition that is worthy of the name progressive should be epistemologically open and methodologically fluid. It should be open. It should be open to wisdom traditions from any culture and religious tradition, even outside of the Islamic intellectual tradition as well. Yeah. So, for example, we should be open to ideas and wisdom coming from not only other religious traditions, but also non-religious traditions like secular liberalism, humanism. There are no rigid boundaries. We don't put any rigid boundaries around which knowledge we consider to be authentic and valid. Yeah. And because it is epistemologically open, therefore, there is, unlike the predominant approaches to the Islamic intellectual tradition, its entire worldview is future-oriented. Yes, it is not, it does not buy into this idea that authenticity is always to be found in the past. And it doesn't buy into this idea that the past should constantly impose itself upon the present and the future. Yeah. So these are kind of, so why be that? Why be like that? Why should we be Muslims like that? Aren't I diluting the Islamic intellectual tradition? Is there anything Islamic left? If we approach this, if we have this approach, of course there is something left. And I know, I mean, first of all, as I said, this is the way progressive Islam approaches the Islamic intellectual tradition is not, it's a question of continuities and discontinuities. So we've had approaches to the Islamic intellectual tradition along these lines in the past. Yeah. So, I mean, Professor Shadab Ahmed's book on what is Islam, the importance of being Islamic, documents to in great lengths. He goes to great lengths to document the existence of the kind of creative, innovative, forward-looking, open-ended Islam that has existed in the past. He actually refers to the Bengal to Balkan paradigm. I think he uses the word paradigm to say that actually for about from about 15th to the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, the main paradigm through which Islam was being conceptualized was very much, there are a lot of affinities between that kind of Islam, the intellectual cosmopolitan Islam that, for example, characterized certain periods of Ottoman Islamic history, was very much, willing to be innovative, be creative. We know, for example, that in one of the during the Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century, for example, the hudud were replaced with there was no application of the hudud, were replaced with financial penalties. Yeah. In other words, there was willingness and there was this the approach to conceptualizing Islam was existent at that time, even at that time, to allow the religious intellectuals and elite of that time to depart from what many Muslims today still consider to be immutable aspects of Sharia. Mainly the application, the literal application of the hudud laws. Yeah, and we can, of course, dig deeper in Islamic history and look at the episodes in which Islam was approached from this perspective. So it is nothing new in a sense. It's a kind of re-emphasis on approaches to the Islamic intellectual tradition that did exist in the past. All right. So so why? Obviously, if we approach Islam in this manner, well, it's much more easy. It's much easier then for us to appreciate ideas regardless of the genealogical origin. Yeah, we can appropriate any good wisdom, any good idea, any regardless of where it comes from. May that be liberation theology, as I will talk about later on, or issues pertaining to gender justice, or even issues pertaining to specific theological views of what the nature of God is. Yeah. So there is this flexibility inbuilt in this approach. Yeah, and this the flexibility to not only absorb but also to integrate in an authentic manner ideas that might not have been a product of concrete historical trajectory of Islam as such. Nonetheless, they are seen to be in accordance with the broader worldview and the values of the Islamic intellectual tradition from the perspective that we approach it. All right. So the second component is Islamic liberation theology, and this is so these ideas I have intentionally placed number one, creative thought and innovative thought, as number one, because that trickles and permeates just about every other dimension. Yeah. So, and because of the fact that progressive Muslim thought is epistemologically open, and because it is flexible and fluid, because it doesn't draw rigid boundaries around itself, it is able to absorb, integrate, and appropriate, even, if you like, ideas, discourses into our own context, a religious context, even if they, as I said, were not necessarily part of our historical experience. So Islamic liberation theology is one such example, and in this sense, Islamic liberation theology owns a lot to liberation theology movements that have sprung out in the South American context. Yeah. So of course we can support these kinds of ideas on a particular reading of the Quran and the Sunnah, but the leading Islamic liberation theologians, progressive Islamic liberation theologians, such as Professor Hassan Hanafi and Ali Ashkar Engineer, and especially in the case of Professor Hassan Hanafi, they themselves, many of the ideas that they have used to develop an Islamic liberation theology, they themselves admit to the fact that some of these ideas have been developed as a result of them engaging with Catholic liberation theology, or from that that came out of the South American context. All right, good. So yes, so that's another major component. So why should we approach Islam from an Islamic liberation theology? Obviously, in today's world, there are huge disparities, still huge disparities between the global North and the global South. And the disparities between Muslims themselves also, economic, especially economic disparities, are huge. Yeah, and the current prevalent neoliberal systems essentially are inadequate and are part of the problem in creating and maintaining the unjust status quo. So we obviously we express solidarity with movements who are resisting and trying to find alternative pathways that are not part of the not part of this unjust status quo. Many socialist forces that exist around the world. I don't know if you know, guys, recently, a couple of years ago, Progressive International was established with the headquarters in London. and they are very much working on these issues. And because we have this approach to our Islamic tradition, we can hold hands with them and in fidelity walk with them and stand in solidarity with those kinds of ideas and say that, yes, Islamic tradition does have something to contribute to these problems and issues. And we can say that in full faithfulness. And we can, stand in solidarity with these kinds of movements, because there is that affinity in between our worldviews. All right, another component is this issue of gender justice. Yeah. So we all know that gender and religion have had a very problematic. It's been, historically speaking, religion has been strongly appropriated by patriarchy, and often religious views and customs and practices have been justified through a patriarchal understanding and approach to religious traditions in general and Islamic tradition in particular. Yeah. So the progressive approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition uses concepts such as patriarchy and gender as important theoretical and analytical tools to understand these injustices, that these unjust patriarchal interpretations of the Islamic tradition that have been very harmful to women of faith in general and Muslim women in particular. Ranging from female genital mutilation and cutting to various forms of honor-based violence. All of these, religious control of women in marriages, construction of Muslim family laws that are unjust, even constructions of the Islamic intellectual tradition that, the tafsir and the fiqh, all of these sciences have been constructed in absence of female experiences and voices. Now this is slowly changing, thankfully, and the progressive approaches to the Islamic intellectual tradition, as I said, are an important voice in this space. Yeah. Why approach the Islam? I mean, this is more or less obvious. Obviously, if we approach, we are deeply, as progressive Muslims, we are deeply convinced that the Islamic message is that of gender equality, and that any patriarchal or androcentric approaches to the Islamic tradition are doing a disservice to the higher ideals and values of the Islamic message, and they are essentially betraying what the Islamic message, in consonance with other religious traditions that are based on the prophetic spirit of equality, justice, and solidarity with the marginalized. So we can stand proudly and say that in the world of Me Too movements, and in the world of gender justice, gender justice or gender justice, in the world of gender justice awareness, we can say infidelity and with integrity that the way we approach the Islamic intellectual tradition and understand it, we can support these causes, and we can help bring them about. Yeah. a human rights-based approach to the Islamic tradition. In many ways, gender issues are very much part of course, a human rights-based approaches to Islamic tradition. Essentially, the 2 points that I want to emphasize in this respect is this idea that Islamic human rights schemes and so-called Western secular human rights schemes essentially are conceptually compatible, and that's what I have argued in that book, using examples of a number of progressive Muslim scholars. Yeah. So why they are justified and why in a different manner and conceptualized differently, conceptually they are compatible. Yeah. We know that the mainstream approaches have always rejected the universalist claims of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on certain approaches to the Islamic intellectual tradition. They have always expressed reservations, basically saying that this is a cultural imperialism, imposition of Western values, and so on and so forth. We do not share that view. We believe that the United Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter were a result of fairly broad consensus and focus as a result of negotiations and consensus that was built at a broad level, and input from all cultures was sought and integrated, and therefore that this idea of universal human rights is not just a Western liberal concept, but it is very much an idea that has, although it surfaced and kind of although it was given an articulation only in the 1948 after the Second World War, the kinds of ideas, the kinds of understandings that have contributed to the actual articulation and the actual writing down of the document is based on a common human heritage and wisdom that the Islamic tradition is part of as well. Yeah. So, progressive Islam refuses to indulge in providing legitimacy to any binaries, such as justice is Islamic or love is Christian, or any kinds of binaries that want to delineate and they want to separate certain discourses and say that this is purely Western, this is purely Islamic, are highly problematic from the perspective of progressive Islam, because progressive approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition believes that ideas are not result of these hermetically sealed civilizations that have never cross-pollinated or have never interacted with each other, and that they only can claim monopoly over a particular idea or whatever it might be. Yeah. So as far as progressive Muslims are concerned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is as Islamic as any other, from a conceptual perspective. Of course, it was given the language that is used is the language of let's call it secular liberalism, but all of these ideas progressive Islam can justify and rationalize from within its own narrative. Yeah. I hope I have made myself clear in that respect. Rationalist contextualist approaches essentially, and I know perhaps I'm over time. This is like the second point perhaps. I will not go into the other two. Oh, I've got my slides in the wrong order. The next point is basically saying that when we think of ethical values, there has been mainstream approaches to Islam have always prioritized revelation over reason, text over reason, and they have always sought to deduce their ethical theories through texts. Yeah, progressive Muslims, Islam essentially turns this upside down and says that it's impossible to, there's no conflict between reason and revelation. You cannot but approach revelation, and especially in terms of texts, but through your own reason. Yeah, and that values are independent of any textual sources of ethics. Yeah, they are inborn, so to speak. They are part of our inborn rationality. Yeah. So that's why we, as Professor Abdul Karim Surush says, we follow religion because it is just. We not because justice doesn't depend upon religion. Religion depends upon justice. So essentially, we can say that ethical moral values are rationalist in nature, and therefore they can be shared with other people who come from different worldviews, may they be theistic or non-theistic. Yeah, and this is what actually enables humanity to have a common, shared pool of values. Yeah. Having said that, we also understand that many of these values can be contextually driven and contextually dependent. So in one context, justice might mean something else compared to a different context. Yeah. And I can see I have a spelling mistake. There is the last point, open to new conceptualization of ethical moral values, which means, again, that unlike the dominant approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition that are heavily vested in pre-modern articulations and conceptualizations of things like such as justice and goodness or whatever it is, progressive Islam is able to, because of all of these other elements that I've talked about, is able to reconceptualize or conceptualize anew what justice might mean. And this concept was very different to what it was in the 7th century Arabia. Yeah. All right. Let me see if I can move the slide. Another important theme in progressive Muslim thought is this idea that we are very comfortable with affirming religious pluralism, right? Irreducible religious pluralism. Yeah. Why? Because because there's several reasons. Because uncertainty and pluralism is inevitable at a number of different levels. Yeah. First of all, at an ontological level, we believe that God is Allahu Akbar, means Allah is really greater. The concept of God is always greater than our own concept of what God is. Yeah. So it's non-exhaustible, inexhaustible. Yeah. So there's that ontological gap between our knowledge of God and God, as well as epistemologically speaking. As soon as we deal with texts, we are dealing with symbols that have potential meaning, that can have different types of meanings. The significance of that meaning can change. So relativism and non-absolute knowledge creeps in at so many levels. So it is impossible. And we rely on language to describe what God is, and we know that language is an inadequate tool. It's that's all we have, but at the end of the day, we have to come to terms with the fact that it's an inadequate tool in actually explaining and understanding the nature of God. All right. So in that sense, progressive Islam is a form of Islamic mysticism. Yeah, and it kind of builds upon existing tendencies within Islamic mysticism of people like Ibn al-Arabi and Rumi and others who have talked about God in the Islamic tradition from that kind of perspective. The last 2 points is something that I haven't really discussed in my book much, but I have over time realized, as I have expanded my knowledge of theology and other issues, that actually progressive Islam has lots of affinity with something called process theology. Yeah, process theology is based on a panentheistic view of God. Right? Basically, it's kind of a midpoint between theism and pantheism, where God is seen as something that is, the universe is within God, but God is larger than the universe. So there's lots of metaphors that are being used in process theology to describe this, like God is life in which all life unfolds, or God is love in which all love. But most importantly, this idea that God is a relational, God is relational, and it is in process of becoming. Right. So this moves away from the classical theistic view of God that considers God to be this immovable mover, someone who is not affected by the creatures, by the creation, someone who is kind of stands above and observes, and at times intervenes supernaturally. Yeah. So Islam. Again, Ibn al-Arabi is a good example of a pre-modern approach, yeah, and in the more modern context, some of the ideas of Muhammad Iqbal would have a lot of affinity with this kind of approach to Islamic theology. I'm hoping to, in the near future, to be able to say more on this, and I'm just currently working a little bit on developing Islamic process theology more fully. There is one very a wonderful young Muslim academic in Norway by the name of Farhan Shah, who is done a lot of work. I mean, his PhD thesis is on Islamic process theology. And if you are interested in to know more about Islamic process theology, I highly recommend Farhan's writings. And finally, progressive Islamism. Essentially, in this respect, when it comes to the relationship between religion and politics, Islam and politics, progressive Islam believes in the importance of civil society, democratic values, constitutional democracy, and all of these are justified on a particular approach, as I said, to the Islamic intellectual tradition, especially this concept of maqasid al-sharia, can be used quite, but not the mainstream approach. There is a contextualist approach to maqasid al-sharia. This is the progressive approach. It's contextualist and it's based on rationalist Islamic theology and ethics. It's not semi-contextualist, as in the mainstream Sunni Islam, or contextualist, as in the Salafis. Salafis also say they believe maqasid al-sharia, but they have a very contextualist approach. So here, as I said, it is possible to develop what I call progressive Islamism that reconciles Islamic political theory with constitutional democracy. And we have few people in the past, especially Ali Abdul Razik, the 20th century Al-Azhar educated a Muslim scholar, who has talked about this idea that the caliphate is basically an institution that was entirely historical. It's a product of historical forces, that it's not part of normative teachings of the Quran and so on. Yeah. So why is that important? We know the value of the problems associated with theocracies and various types of dictatorships that the Muslim world, much of the Muslim world, is suffering from. And so we can comfortably and confidently say that Islam can be reconciled with Islamic political theory can be reconciled with constitutional democracy. There are some examples of this emerging, for example, in the context of Tunisia, and the Al-Nahda political party in Tunisia under the leadership of Rashid Ghannouchi has nearly arrived at this kind of understanding, although they perhaps have a little bit more to go. But if there is a particular political party in the Muslim world that comes closest to this kind of understanding, it would be the Al-Nahda party in Tunisia. So yeah, so these are essentially these constitutive elements. of progressive Islamic approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition. So why, in the briefest manner possible, basically we can say that progressive Islam is a continuation of a cosmopolitan, rationalist, and egalitarian approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition that existed in one form or another in the past. Yeah, and it enables us to live in the modern world, and contribute to it meaningfully, contribute to the multi-religious, pluralistic, and democratic nature of the modern world, and contribute to it, because all of these elements, I'm under no pretense that that the current world is not a rosy picture, and that democracy is often in danger of reactionary forces, not just in the Muslim world but in the non-Muslim world. But we can confidently say that if we approach Islam from these lenses and from these perspectives, we can actually help safeguard a world in which pluralism, democracy, egalitarian, kind of social justice-oriented world. We can say that that is what Islam also aspires to be, and that we have something to offer to the world in order to help bring this world about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adis, for that illuminating talk. It's really brilliant. I mean, and also it was very hopeful as well. You know, as we look to the future, there are hopeful signs that, in a sense, that this discourse, these ideas, you know, can take shape, or are seeds that we plant for the future as well. So that's really fun. I love how you ended it with that message of hope, but also a sense of realism as well. In a sense, we know that we are in the minority in the Islamic world, really, and that certain ideas have really gained dominance and superiority. Having said that, perhaps now we can open this up to a conversation, questions, and I'm really looking forward to this part of the session as well, for people to ask Adis, you know, questions about how he constitute the ideas of progressive Islam and progressive Muslims. Yeah.
Thank you.
Since maybe since no one is asking the question yet, no one is jumping up. Faraz will let us know if there's someone who's asking questions. Maybe I can ask you about your personal journey, Adis. You know, like many of us, you know, I grew up in quite a Salafi household, and you know, we had a very rigid understanding. And you know, as I went through a secular education system, I realized that the world is a lot more complex than what I had been taught. You know. So what is your journey around? How did you come to an understanding that Islam is much richer than what you originally were taught?
Yeah, so I grew up in socialist Yugoslavia, and so Islam was more like a cultural thing to us, which is not, I'm not denigrating it. Actually, I think the more I think about it, that was probably the best way to understand Islam. Perhaps, I mean, in many ways, it had, you know, it understood that certain things were meant to be only for the past, and kind of, it wasn't afraid to let go. But you know, but it didn't kind of, it didn't justify its own worldview from an intellectual kind of lens and kind of work these things through. I think in many ways it arrived at the correct point, but it didn't do so by you know, entertaining these ideas and working them out the way I have presented it today in the so yeah, I became very active during my undergraduate studies at University of Western Australia. I became active with the MSA, Muslim Student Association. And I started reading a lot of academic literature on Islam, especially Fazlur Rahman, the Pakistani intellectual. I was noticing, I was a vice president of Muslim Society, Student Association at UWA, and later on a president as well. So I was always involved with Muslims, and I was always aware of the differences of opinion, and I was aware of the conservative, but I was never comfortable with it, and I was always willing. I was always really interested in this question as to why are there such radically different interpretations of Islam, which led me to doing a PhD thesis on contemporary Islamic hermeneutics and looking at the interpretational presuppositions and that in progressive and Salafi interpretations of Islam. Where do these interpretational differences come from? What are the reasons why they are there, both metatextually and textually? So, yeah, I was never, in that sense, I was very lucky, I think, that I came across the works of Professor Khalid Abu al-Fadl, Ibrahim Musa, Fazlur Rahman, Professor Abdullah Saeed from University of Melbourne, you know, and people like Zibamir Husseini, Amina Wadood, Sadia Sheikh, one of my favorite Muslim scholars from University of Cape Town. So, and because I had access to academic literature through my university, I was, you know, when I read the book edited by Professor Omid Safi on progressive Muslims, I said to myself, wow, this is the most beautiful Islam, and I'm going to dedicate my life to contributing to, in any manner I can, in kind of further developing and you know, letting people know that, I know this is of course in the immediate post 9/11 context, where there was a cloud over Islam and Muslims, and you know, and having that different understanding of Islam that is based on social justice, gender justice, and religious pluralism was so critically needed at that point in time. As a kind of a countervailing, like a counter narrative to how Islam was being seen. I just felt that, you know, that was something that strongly appealed to me, and that I wanted to be part of.
Cool, thank you. Are there any other questions from people?
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Edis. It was such an informative presentation. It was great. Just my question is that just based on my research and based on what I'm witnessing in Muslim community, especially in Australia, how do you see the future of gender justice among Muslims, especially in Australia? Because what I see, we are far behind many other, you know, countries like Muslim in US and you know, Europe. So how do you think that progressive Islam is going in Australia is going to have any ever happening?
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Nafisa.
Assalamu alaikum, how are you?
We meet for the first time face to face, but we'll be in touch by email and on Facebook.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting time aside to be with us here today.
Thank you.
Dr. Nafisa, for those of you who don't know, has done some amazing work on the intersection between gender, culture, and Islam amongst Muslim communities in Australia, especially in relation to domestic violence issues. So I can understand your concerns. I really do. I can understand your concerns. I would like to first of all say that I do not have an in-depth understanding of Australian Muslim communities. I'm not a sociologist or an anthropologist of religion. A lot of my work at the level of Muslim communities is either instructing Bosnian Muslim kids or doing interfaith work. So I don't have a very good understanding of especially what happens in Sydney and Melbourne. So having said that, the only kind of objective thing that I could use to say something is that this recent Islam and Muslims in Australia survey that we've done at Griffith University, that was encouraging in many ways. One of the main findings of that study was that liberal and progressive approaches, we asked people to kind of apologize themselves, to say, what do you see yourself as, a progressive, liberal, reformist, Sufi, or whatever. There were about 10 categories. And many people place themselves in in liberal, progressive categories. And in relation to gender issues in particular, there was a strong egalitarian spirit there, like people who have taken part in the survey were saying that women should not be submissive, that they should be equal partners in marriage. There was a lot of good news for a lot of understandings pertaining to gender relations that we desire to be, that we find desirable.
Yeah.
So that survey was done, as I said, in late 2019, and it was based on more than 1,000 respondents. So there is some good news. Having said that, I know that we have a lot of work to do, that the religious leadership, the traditional religious leadership in Australia, is a long way from affirming the kinds of ideas that we would like them to affirm in relation to gender issues.
Yeah.
We can just keep on applying the pressure. We can keep on doing the work that we do. And we need to enter into some kind of dialogue with them, although I don't know how this can be done. I think they are too invested in their own understanding, and while they are willing perhaps to change certain marginal, they are willing to perhaps give some ground, but from our perspective, it is not sufficient.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for your insight.
Nafise, could I ask you whether what do you think of Adis's answer? Are you hopeful? And also, you started off from a point of hopelessness. Where is your sense of a sense of disturb, perhaps, or hopelessness coming from? About this issue.
Witnessing, being among Muslim community, it's really important. I've been among, especially women and men, doesn't matter, but I find it especially in mosque, the treatment of women is appalling. Mm-hmm. The lecture and khutbah, it's so bad. Mm-hmm. They're just demeaning women, and unfortunately, some people that were in those khutbah, they were women and men that were highly educated, but they were silent. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it's kind of a hypocrisy when they go to the mosque and when imam or whoever says something very sexist, no one say anything. But if the same thing happens in a workplace or somewhere in a secular society, it's completely different. And I find it is really annoying. And I have something happened that we just tried with a group of very few Muslim women that we just have a progressive view. We just try to change, and at the end I was thinking it's affecting my mental health, so I just ignore, and I said I'm not going to get involved until at least more women are helping, and we have more male allies. That I couldn't see it here. And look at and I think mosques are the best example of how the women is treated. And the recent research I did, it was about gender segregation in mosques. And it's amazing that all the women are interviewed, 20 women, even those that believe in gender segregation, they were saying that even the physical space in the mosque is so degrading women. It's just at the back of the, and it's always controlling women's body, and all the childcare is just on women. even women are not allowed to go to the hall and just ask a question. So it can show a lot. I think it shows a lot about Muslim community.
Yeah, yeah. In that respect, Australia is very much behind the developments. Like these women-only mosques or women-friendly, or in America and parts of Europe. Yeah. So.
Yeah, but I think also it's important what you say, Nafise. I think the imperative is also for us to speak out against, like, for example, even with our imam saying those khutbahs, for example, which demean women. I think it is imperative that we need to say something. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, is there anyone else?
Yes, please. Hi. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Duderija. Thank you so much for your talk today. My question is I guess two-pronged. First of all, I guess a bit of a background in terms of like my upbringing as well was very, very kind of Salafi oriented, very I guess it was whatever the elders kind of approved of was basically what was Islamic, and what the elders didn't approve of was not Islamic. And I grew up with a lot of evidence of hypocrisy and stuff, and it only was in my early kind of 20s when I started to notice the hypocrisy and actually call it out for what it is. When it comes to certain issues that are really touchy, but not many people want to talk about it, but we kind of need to, as an offshoot of the women's right issue, which is just as important, what about things like LGBT issues in Islam and I guess sexual justice and all of that? Is there a space that you find that Islam would be able to, or Islam as you understand it, would be able to not simply tolerate, but actually endorse the rights of and honor these minorities as well?
All right. Yeah. So I don't know who am I speaking to.
My name is Maz.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Maz.
Yeah.
All right. So what I have not directly dealt with LGBTQ issues myself in my writings, because I wanted to leave it to those who identify themselves as such. I certainly do believe that it is definitely possible to interpret Islamic intellectual tradition in LGBTQ affirmative ways. And in my last book that I co-authored, I rely on I and my co-authors have summarized some of the main arguments used by leading scholars in that space, like Siraj ul-Haq,
Scott Cooper,
and Junaid Jahangir. I think they have offered us a lot of food for thought, and they have offered us many arguments for us to at least reconsider the standard narrative. At least.
Yeah.
Obviously, I reject any kinds of hudud-related punishments and all of that. I think has absolutely no space in Islamic law and ethics. But even if, let's say, even if, and this is not my view, as I said, I believe in the LGBT affirmative interpretations of Islam. But even if certain Muslims were to have theological objections to these issues, the fact that progressive Islam is based on what I see progressive Islamism, and as I said, reconciles Islamic political theory with constitutional democracy, that extends basic human rights to all minorities, regardless of religion, sexual orientation. So even simply on the premise of progressive Islamism, progressive Islam can accommodate LGBTQ communities.
Thank you. And just one last bit.
Sure.
Just one last bit. In terms of, so I myself am a member of the intersection between LGBT and Islam, and I've got a very tumultuous relationship with my faith, but I've been holding on to it for dear life for as long as I can think of. But what advice would you have for LGBT Muslims? Because I know quite a few as well, and we all kind of, you know, I guess we look up to scholars like yourself who can offer us some hope, because it's a bit tiring living in that hopelessness and in that void. So what kind of advice? What kind of advice do you have to offer for us?
Have you, sorry, it's Reem. Hi. I just want to
Assalamu alaikum.
and ask you if you've spoken with or know about Afik, who Malaysian scholar of Islam as well, who's mashallah, like he studied in Malaysia, his master's in Islamic studies, and I don't know his whole qualification list, but he's a member of Muslim LGBTIQ community as well, and he's very involved in providing that kind of support for them. So if you want, I can give you his contact details. I think he went back, he was in Melbourne for a while, but he went back to Malaysia with COVID and stuff, but he wants to come back here. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say about this issue is that I was recently asked by a young woman who works with the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights if I could find someone to join the podcast. They're doing a youth podcast. So she was looking for an LGBT Muslim woman, focus on women because it's the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. But the fact that they're opening up those conversations and that I find there are small pockets emerging that are starting to recognize that we have to find ways to reconcile these things. And, you know, so I think that that's a positive development. But I think Afik would be a really great person to speak to as well on this issue. Maybe we should try to set something up for him to also do a webinar.
Yes, please. I'd love to speak to him. Yeah.
Yeah. And Mas, you know, in Sydney, if you're based in Sydney, there is the Sydney queer Muslims who are very active, you know, and they work with an African scholar as well.
Yes.
So
yes.
So there is a groupings, and I think that's the only way we do this, isn't it? We have to organize. That's the lesson in all this. We are really weak as individuals, and that is one of the great lessons of liberalism, that as individuals we are nothing really. Once we collectivize, we have some form of power, you know.
Well, exactly. And you know, just to kind of add to that as well, like I personally see myself as quite a bit of an advocate. I'm currently wrapping up my medical degree, inshallah, and so I really want to use this degree to also work with LGBT youth, and hopefully obviously from a healthcare perspective, but I'd love to work on some advocacy. And Islam is also a very important part of my life. And so meeting myself at this intersection, it's important, I guess, to have other people to talk to, because I want to have opportunities to contribute as well. I just don't know how. I don't know what I have to offer.
I mean, the only other piece of advice that I could possibly give is, I mean, at the end of the day, faith is a unique relationship that you have, that we all as individuals have with the divine, and nobody can take that away from you. You know, so as long as you, I mean, we all need to nurture that relationship with the divine, and it's difficult. I know it's often difficult to, because we fall prey to other people's understanding of Islam in our case, and especially those, you know, the traditionalist voices are still predominant. And, you know, when we conceptualize Islam, conceptualize God, conceptualize what it means to be a pious Muslim, we by default, even I still by default, have a particular image in mind. You know, that is what it means to be a Muslim. But we have to resist that and remind ourselves of the diversity, and at the end, as I said, at the end of the day, your Muslimness, I guess, if that's the word, at the end of the day, the lowest common denominator or the core of it is your own subjective, unique relationship with the divine, and nobody can take that away from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. That was very comforting to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, perhaps since is there anyone else? I mean, you know, Adis, I'm just thinking about your work with also around Salafism as well. And I'm just also thinking about reform within Islam. So in a sense, I think what the Salafis have successfully done, you know, because there was a reform project from the 19th to the 20th century, by people like Rashid Rida, who are actually complex scholars. They are amazing scholars, Abdu and Rida and Afghani, etc. And Iqbal as well. You mentioned Muhammad Iqbal. So in a sense, I think what happened, because they wanted to reintroduce ijtihad into Islamic discourse once again, because the door of ijtihad was not closed to them, it was open. And I think that was a success. But in a sense, what I feel, and perhaps you could discuss this, the success was captured by certain groups in a way to close again that door, you know, so that door which was meant to be open, which was, I think, the fact that we have a phenomenon like Salafism as the dominant form of Islam today is because of the success of the Salafi reformers like Rida and Abdu. You know, because, you know, like Rida, for example, called himself a Salafi. So in a sense, I think, but their aim was to open up thought, open up Islam to rationality. But in a sense, their success also included this failure, this capture, this closure again, where Islam once again became really ahistorical. And I'm just thinking whether you think that the fault is actually in their message itself, because their message, personally for me, it's actually one of even though I agree, Rida is a very complex scholar and so was Abdu, but I'm just thinking that whether their message was fundamentally ahistorical in a way.
Yeah. All right. So first of all, let me recommend a reading. Henry Lozier has written an important book called The Making of Salafism that traces all these, traces the intellectual genealogy of especially during that period from Muhammad Abdu to now. All right, so a couple of things here. Every scholar, we must approach every scholar from the perspective of the context in which they lived, and the ideas. So Muhammad Abdu was basically reacting to the taqlidi-based manhaj of the main schools of thought. And he said, you know, these guys are so entrenched in their thinking, and because they have invested, because their interpretational methodology is considered to be a kind of non-negotiable aspect, it's impossible for them to deal with modernity and the challenges of that colonialism and modernity brought to the shores of Muslim majority world. So he was reacting to the taqlidi-based hermeneutic of the Hanafis, of the Shafi'is, and so in that sense, in academic literature, that approach is viewed is termed modernist Salafiyya. The modernist Salafiyya, the modernist Salafis, who, in my view, eclectically and more, in many ways, ahistorically, as you put it, they try to somehow circumvent and go beyond, you know, they try to unshackle, they try to, because the religious leadership was so invested, as I said, in the taqlidi-based hermeneutic. They try to approach Islam from a different perspective by emphasizing the Quran more, de-emphasizing the Hadith. Yeah. So so they questioned that the taqlidi method based hermeneutic, and and because they questioned the taqlidi based hermeneutic, they were kind of, in a way, at least at one level, they are affirming the ideas of the intellectual opponents of the taqlid-based hermeneutic that existed throughout Islamic intellectual history, namely those of the Ahl al-Hadith, what we call the let's say the Salaf or Hanbalis. Yeah. So what happened is, throughout the medieval Islamic period, the main two intellectual camps were the taqlidi-based hermeneutic versus the so-called neo-Ahl al-Hadith, or what do they call it? The ittiba. It's this idea of going back to Quran and Sunnah only, yeah, rather than approaching the Islamic intellectual tradition through the hermeneutic of the madhahib. Yeah. So Abdu, by criticizing the taqlid method, kind of was supporting, even if it was in kind of in a rhetorical sense, his ideas were attacking the taqlid-based method, and therefore they were more aligned with this idea of going back to Quran and the Sunnah that was appropriated by the Ahl Hadith and the Hanbalis. Yeah. So they jumped on this wagon, yeah, and appropriated it and used their own understanding of the Quran and Sunnah, which was different from the understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah by Muhammad Abdu, because he had a much more Quran-centric approach, and he also emphasized this historical legacy of Sunnah Amaliya, as something that is different from Hadith. Yeah. So, but by criticizing the taqlid method, he opened kind of the Pandora's box, or he kind of gave credence indirectly to these alternative approaches, the intellectual opponents of the taqlid-based method, that also used the concept of Salaf Salih. Of course, this concept is appropriated by everyone and has been always. And they said, no, we are the ones who are following in the footsteps of the Salaf Salih. So, and this had to do with lots of things. Rashid Rida actually departed from the teachings of Muhammad Abdu later on, and he ended up in Saudi Arabia, and he Salafized, his Salafism became a neo-Ahl Hadith form of Salafism. Yeah. So in that sense, yes, Muhammad Abdu could be critiqued because inadvertently, because he departed from the taqlidi-based method, he provided kind of more credence to the voices of these neo-Ahl Hadith Salafis. But of course, I have tried to argue that in many ways, the taqlidi-based method and the neo-Ahl Hadith method to Islam have so much in common that we can't really use the taqlidi, the mainstream Sunni Islam of today. The mainstream Sunni Islam of today makes the Salafi, neo-Ahl Hadith Salafi approach to Islam reasonable. All right. So it is very difficult to critique neo-Ahl Hadith Salafism if your main point of reference is your main taqlid-based Islam of the four schools of thought, because there is so much overlap at so many levels. And that's why, I mean, I probably have lost friends or have been exposed myself to a lot of criticism on this issue like when it comes to violent extremism, how to go about providing a critique from within the Islamic interpretative tradition that can say that, look, the Islam of these guys is just completely unreasonable. It is completely, anti-Islamic. You cannot use the language and the interpretations of Islam or mainstream Sunnis to do that, because there is too much overlap. Right? There is too much overlap on many important issues. Not let alone between the non-violent Salafism and violent Salafism. There's 95% overlap between them. Well, if I could use it in percentage-wise. When it comes to mainstream Sunnis, if I had to give a percentage, and I have tried to do it in a way that is neither too kind of unduly generalizing, but not but not also not. I've mounted my argument in such a way that it does have conceptually explanatory power, but it is not also too generalizing. So that is to say that if you like Venn diagrams, yeah. So if violent extremism is to my right, then you have Salafism, non-violent Salafism, maybe shares 90% with it. Then you have the mainstream Sunnism that shares a lot on many important epistemological and gender-based issues in relation to takfir, in relation to jihad. All of these questions, on many of these questions, mainstream Sunnism shares a lot of ground with these. So it is very difficult to then mount a critique if you accept these ideas and these interpretational approaches. So basically what I have tried to argue is that for mainstream Sunnism to be in a better position to convincingly, at a discursive level, intellectual, interpretational level, to rebut the kinds of ideas that exist among violent jihadists, it really has to shift much more towards the progressive spectrum. Otherwise, it's not convincing. If you tell them, oh, you are misusing this hadith, don't you know that this hadith is weak or it's, but your entire edifice of Quranic interpretation and your entire epistemology is exactly identical, then how simply engaging in hurling of hadith against each other is not going to accomplish much. Yeah. I'm trying to do this in an intellectually and academically responsible manner, but the mainstream Sunni response has been less than what is necessary, because unless we are able to critique these ideas from a radically different vantage point, then who's going to say that in 15, 20 years we're going to face the same problem again? Yeah.
Can I add something? I'd like to know your thoughts on this, but when I'm listening to you, I'm agreeing with you furiously, but I'm also thinking, how our concept of God and the kind of relationship or the kind of entity that we think of God as, then also feeds into the kind of interpretations that we hold on to. So if you believe that God is, a punisher, or, that is stickler, that if you pray with your hands like this, or you do this, or you didn't do your wudu properly, like that, your prayer won't count, or your fast won't count, or these things, that everything is very, it's a very authoritarian sort of, and God, then you create a situation where, when faced with two different interpretations, so say you can wear clothes to your elbow or you can wear clothes to your wrist, you'll say, oh, I'll take the the more extreme one, or because just in case, right? Like, you know, because God is going to punish me. So you see this shift in the way people are choosing and understanding it, because they're kind of, because they want to be on the safe side in terms, and the kind of, and not experience the guilt or experience all of these things as well that comes with it. So when we think about God, if we thought about God in a much more, and we talked about God in a much more, you know, loving, kind, and encouraging of independent thought and critical thought, that God doesn't care as long as you came to the reasons, you know, in a you know, ethical and you know, heart, like in a manner that reflected the intention, then, you know, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you, Reem, and it's so nice to see you, by the way. And congratulations on completing your PhD.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's good to get it done. Thank you.
That's why, for example, unless in certain situations, we will continue to be vulnerable to these ideas unless we deconstruct the assumptions and the very concepts that are kind of the building blocks upon which these interpretations stand. You know, so for example, when it comes to the nature of female and femininity and masculinity and female and male sexuality, there's virtually no difference between mainstream Sunnism and Salafism and Jihadi Salafism. The only difference is, oh yeah, okay, you don't have to wear the niqab, or you can leave your face. But all the other ideas.
Yeah. And the relational issues as well, particularly when it comes to relationships, it's the same, you know?
It is exactly the same. The same ideas about women as fitna, women as awra, same, you know, same ugly ideas about what it means to be a male, what it means to be a female. So these ideas, it is these ideas that we have to problematize. Otherwise, we're going to keep on facing the same problem. And then we cannot, I mean, to be honest with you, I understand why these jihadi Salafis are often so critical of these so-called mainstream Sunnis, you know, because, you know, you tell us one thing, and then when we do it, then you blame us, or you have misunderstood Islam. You know, in many ways, as I said, they make the Islam of jihadi Salafis reasonable in a hermeneutical sense.
Yeah.
I mean, and I have to say this with full disclosure, and I have backed up my ideas academically. I'm not an Islamophobe or anything like that. I want the Muslim community to develop and to prosper and to flourish, but we need to undergo a serious process of deconstruction.
But there's so much fear, right? Like, even if people on a personal level aren't practicing it in this way, even if on a personal level they're not treating their daughters like, you know, or their, you know, wives or whatever in this way, and they don't actually agree with it, there's too much fear associated with challenging some of these ideas. And I think it's not even, I mean, I don't know, I'm not in everyone's head, but it's not even a fear of the institution. Like, it's a fear of God. You know, like, even if it just like people won't do it, but they'll still feel like they don't want to take the, like, if they're wrong, they don't want to change, they don't want to be responsible for thinking something outside.
Exactly. We have internalized a wrong ideal of what it means to be a God, what it means to be a good, a pious Muslim. And that's the problem. If your ideal is distorted and skewed, then how are you ever going to arrive at the correct destination? Like if your signposts are wrong.
But, you know, Reem, I just think that, you know, you're trying to reframe this issue in terms of a theological issue about people's relationship to God. And I think that there is more of a social constructivist kind of issue which is going on. For example, I think, like, for many people, I mean, in the household that I grew up in, for example, it was a matter of ritual, right? Following things to do, you know. So in a sense, I think the question of God seldom entered into it. Like, you know, in fact, we were discouraged to talk about matters of mysticism. That's why I think there is a kind of hatred of Sufism, hatred of a kind of discussions of big questions around theology, because it's a matter, because, a lot of people will say that these may actually lead you astray, so what you do is that you just follow the rules, basically. Just, there are these prescribed rules, and I agree with you. I mean, you overextend these rules as well. Like, if the rule says to your elbow, extend it to the tip of your fingers, you know what I mean? I agree, but I don't think that there is like a fear of God which is I may be misconceived, but I don't think that is what is guiding many of these things. I think it's about following what everyone else is doing.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that's I think it's probably both at play. I'm thinking of my father in particular when I'm thinking about that. And I think for him, he's much more driven by this like existential, stuff than he is by society. But I think for a lot of people, it is that. And I think that also just the fact that people that there became a social status associated with it, that you can start then say that became a bit of a signaling, that you're pious, especially with Saudi Arabia. So I have a serious kind of a serious issue with what I think is a form of cultural imperialism that is happening by Saudi Arabia in the other Muslim countries, kind of spreading that, to be a good Muslim, you have to dress like a Saudi, you have to, like talk, you have to grow your facial hair like a Saudi, you have to do all of these other things, so and that's imperialism, right? That's a kind of what we kind of say, colonization kind of theory, but applied like a Saudis colonizing the Muslim world and turning it into just like mini Saudi states, bringing in people to study in Saudi Arabia and then sending them back to preach in all of these rural areas, and they come back and they have authority because they've spent 4 years in Mecca, and everyone will just believe what they say. And this kind of creep is happening everywhere. I think that's also quite it's quite scary, and it gives that kind of this prestige that comes with having been to Saudi or having been Arabified in that way.
I think also there's just because of these couple of conversations, there's something I want to add as well. In terms of just the other day, I'm part of this group chat, and it's called Bendigo Brothers. And it's where I've moved to for placement, and I love how it's named just brothers. I'm like, well, what about the sisters? But anyways, that's beside the point. Well, no, that's actually part of the bigger issue. But they spent 3 days arguing whether Hazeldene's is halal or not, because a particular organization said that it is, but then there's a particular, and they literally spent 3 days on that group chat debating and then sending multiple kind of paragraphs to each other about whether or not this chicken is halal. And then another one would send this YouTube video of how Hazeldene's is haram, and they're calling halal things haram, and they're calling halal haram halal. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, you guys are just like, if this is like the most pertinent question that's taken you guys 3 days to answer, I don't want to sound arrogant because I'm not all that, but also we have bigger fish to fry in our Muslim community. We have much bigger fish to fry. And I don't think that our salvation is hinged on whether or not we eat that chicken wing. But anyways, and another thing that Dr. Reem was mentioning as well, in terms of the subtle fear, which is the subtle kind of fear of God that happens from within, I experience that all the time because I've done quite a lot of research, in particular with the LGBT issue in Islam, and I've met with a lot of people and all of that, but then other issues as well. And one of the biggest kind of questions that I have is that, well, there is this alternate understanding that is more in line with the values of Islam, great, more in line with compassion, great, more in line with justice, but can God really be that good? Is it possible for God to be that good? Because what if I just for 1 second stop beating myself up and just for 1 second accept myself? What if at the end of the day, God's going to screw me over? So a lot of us in this angst, existential angst all the time, because we have the information on an intellectual level, but at an emotional level, we can't trust the information because we just can't trust that God can be that compassionate, that it is possible for God to be just to everybody. And a lot of my issues personally is like, well, I have all the answers, but if I just rest for 1 day, am I allowed to rest for 1 day? Because if I die tonight, am I going to be screwed over just because I've accepted myself? you know, it becomes this whole issue, and it's nice to know that I'm not alone. Sorry, that was a big rant.
Well, if you define God as most merciful and most kind, and God as love, as we know, we have our Islamic mysticism. There's a strong current there defining God as love. Beloved, God as our beloved. God is most merciful, the most Ar-Rahman Rahim. I mean, there's plenty of material there, so to speak, to construct your God in such a manner. There's no denying that, especially in puritanical forms of religiosity, there is an obsession with purity, with these nitty-gritty kind of, you know, obsessing with just about every aspect of one's life, or, you know, that religion is supposed to regulate every minor aspect of your life, you know. And that's huge. Huge alarm bells should go off. If there is no personal philosophy, can ever have lasting value if it provides you with such detailed prescriptions of how to live your life, because it's going to be outdated sooner or later, and it's going to do you more harm than good. So don't trust any personal philosophy that provides you with a lot of detail about every minute aspect of your life. Focus on these broader, I mean, as I said in process theology, one of the most beautiful ways, and this is something that I've learned relatively recently, moving away from classical theism, in terms of the way classical theism across religious traditions has conceptualized God as an impassible, immovable mover, someone who is kind of a patriarch, someone who is, you know, omniscience, can do everything, knows everything, you know, has everything under control. Whereas in process theology, God's power is conceptualized as in relational terms. God, the more God is powerful, the more God is vulnerable and relational, the more God is open to the suffering and the feelings of the creatures. That's how you conceptualize God's power, not this idea that God can predetermine everything and knows everything, every minute detail of our lives and the future in advance. No. God's perfection is conceptualized in terms of being the being that can be most touched, the being that feels the most the suffering and the joy, even not just the suffering, but also the joy of the creation. You know, imagine like I'm not sure if you are a parent, but you know, what do we consider to be a good parent or a good human being? Is it someone who can unilaterally control their children and who just is like some kind of a dictator, tells them, you know, they have no scope of any personal freedom or any independence and decision making? Okay, that's not how we should consider. That's not how we should conceptualize God. Yeah, as some kind of a tyrant who is constantly wants to control us and punish us. And in process theology and Islamic process theology, God's power and love is expressed in terms of God being most able to be affected by feelings of others, and kind of in terms of vulnerability. Because, you know, when you say someone is a good human being, is because that person can empathize and is open to the sufferings and the joys, not just sufferings, but the joys, you know, of others. Yeah, that's the kind of God I think that we need to think more about, and I think that is the correct understanding of God. God's power does not reside in being able to, overwhelm us with control and being able to determine everything. It's about being the most relational of all the beings. Yeah, I find that the most God-worthy conceptualization of God, and I think intuitively it appeals to us. Yeah, that kind of.
I think so, but yes, but also it appeals. Like I remember when I was younger, my mother told me that she'd heard the most amazing thing on the radio listening to this sheikh, and like this is in the way. And then she said, that just like when you buy a washing machine or a computer, it comes with a manual. God created humanity, and the Quran is our manual. And she just she really, really believed that this was just, really what a blessing God is, that coming from this perspective, that that he gave us this kind of insight so that we could live our lives in such a beautiful way. But I think it was that point when I realized that I think my beliefs were a little bit starting to diverge. I remember that point because I just thought, a manual, really? I have a manual, and he's the owner's manual. I think that some people. So I agree with you that there's comfort for, I think maybe for critical thinkers to believe in a more relational kind of God. But I also think that there are a lot of people, and perhaps even the majority, who find it a safety in the feeling that there is boundaries, that there are rules. Yeah, there are rules and there are boundaries, and they should not change. Yeah, you can just tick them off, and if I just follow this and I just do this and this and this, then I'll just go into heaven, and just give me the manual, right? Just give me the manual and tell me what I have to do to get into heaven, and I'll just do that. Yes, don't make it too vague or too relational.
It begs.
Let's look at the
question of.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say very quickly, it begs the question of whether your allegiance is towards heaven or towards God. If you want to tick all the boxes, is it because you want heaven or is it because you want God?
Yeah.
So,
or you fear hell, really.
Then the allegiance is to yourself.
And can I add something that especially for Muslim in minority, like when we, for immigrant, when they come to a host country's religion is kind of a identity, and they stick to it, and it never, they've been here for 20 years, they usually go for a visit and come back. But when you look at it, even in the host, when you go back, for example, to your own country, you can see the culture change and improve. But they're stuck in that mentality, and they're still in that, I saw that in my community and even in my research, some of the women said the same thing. So it's, I think, a kind of a resistance to our Western culture, and they want to stick to what they learn. And it's always the fear of change. They don't want any change.
It's kind of like a time capsule, when they put some books and you dig it in. It's a bit like that. I know it's the same. I'm from Syria, and I don't know many Syrians here, but I know that the Lebanese community here, I've been to Lebanon a lot. Lebanon is a totally different world compared to the Lebanese community.
Yeah, exactly.
If they go to Lebanon, I think they would be so, their mind would be blown about the kind of progressive approach to life that they have there.
Yeah.
Liberal kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research on when a religious minority, when you migrate from a religious majority and cultural context to minority context, you tend to dig your heels in and become even more rigid, and that happened to, let's say, when the Irish Catholics were going to America in the early 20th century, they went through that. Also, the Jewish community in America, and then it takes time. It takes time for this mindset to change. I mean, in second and third generations of Muslims, we do see that we do see change. Unfortunately, it seems as if that the change can be either towards more Salafi and a more progressive approach. So it splits into, you know, it's not necessarily kind of welcoming or diversity, and it's not cosmopolitan in that sense. Yeah.
And can I say it's really sad, because I've got a teenage girl and I just seeing that these kind of, you know, backwardness just take them off, and they don't want, you know, it's kind of a resistance to a religion at all. And then they just go to other end to be more westernized and just be away from their culture and religion and good aspect of it. So I think something like here, it's amazing, you know, if we can have a forum like this that Muslim and they've got progressive view, they can talk and share their idea. I could see that I research about Muslim, but I always present for mainstream. I never presented to any Muslim community because they are not interested to hear. So I think it's really great that people that are like-minded that can have this forum regularly. And I really thank Muslim Collective that for doing such a great job. And then we can share idea, and then maybe we can do a bit more.
I think we have a space for maybe one or two more final questions for us. You have a question?
Yeah, I just have one question. When you, you know, put forward your like thesis and your, you know, work, what is the most common resistance from the Muslim community that you find? Like, what is it that they come to you with and question that, oh, I don't like this or I don't like that, you know?
All right, usually they say, oh, this is like, they use the word secular, maybe sometimes they use the word liberal. And it's interesting, I always tell them, go read both of my books on progressive Islam, and maybe I just used the word secular once in my first book, and in a negative way.
Right.
So there are all these, you know, to be honest with you, it's been now 10 years since I published my first book on progressive Islam, and very, very few people, even academics, Western Muslim academics who are more of a conservative bent, they were very reluctant to review the book, engage with it, because they actually know if they were to do, they don't have arguments, honestly, because I'm not saying this is not a reflection of how good my work is.
Yeah.
I'm actually relying on the scholars of progressive scholars. I've been involved in so many debates, and I've tried not to, but very, very few of them, not to mention your ordinary conservative Muslim, especially like the kind of Hizbul Tahriri kind of guy, they are so reluctant to actually engage the work at an intellectual academic level. So they resort to stereotypical kind of reductionist, and which are always, of course, at best half truths. You know, so they say, oh, you are going, you know, you are either a liberal or you are secular or
Westernized.
So all of these tropes that really don't really apply. And as you can see, the 8 points that I've presented, I haven't really used the word Western, secular, or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Are you? So I am really disappointed by the fact that there's been very little engagement from conservative Muslim academics in the Muslim world with this kind of literature. I don't know. everyone is invested, you know, everyone's invested, you know, they are part of their networks, they part of their communities. It's very hard to stand up and say, look, okay, yeah, I mean, this can be seen from a different perspective. You know, and the way I've gone about, the way I have approached defining progressive Islam is basically I have tried to outline what the assumptions are. You know, I wasn't actually advocating for any approach. Even Professor Khalid Abul Fadl, who is one of my gurus, when he wrote the preface to my book, he said, one of the most important things that this author has done in this book is not to advocate for a particular approach, but to lay out the so-called bare bones of these assumptions and what gives rise to these interpretations. You know, so I've tried really hard to be an objective and an academic as much as I possibly could.
Yeah.
And I also, the reason why I have invested a lot of time and effort in the concept of Sunnah is because these traditionalists, of course, especially the Salafis, they consider themselves as the inheritance of
the Sunnah. Yeah, correct.
Whereas actually they depart markedly. If you look at the concept of Sunnah during the formative period of Islam, much more dynamic. It's about ethics and values. It's about overall legacy of what it means to be a Muslim. Nothing to do with hadith, nothing to do with this legalistic approach to Islam, you know. So, but we must engage with these ideas. Otherwise, they will call us out and say, look, you don't take our tradition seriously and things like that. That was one of the reasons why I have invited scholars to help me also, you know, to discuss these ideas, and also on Maqasid, my edited volume on Maqasid, to show that progressive Muslims are willing to and they have nothing to fear from the Islamic intellectual tradition. That it has lots of richness and there's lots of you know, lots of material there, raw material that has been interpreted in many different ways for a very long period of time. So we shouldn't be fearful of engaging with Islamic history, with Islamic intellectual tradition. We should use it not apologetically to score an ideological point, but to say that there is more to the Islamic intellectual tradition than what these guys are telling us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adis. Thank you very much. I think, and thanks for your question. I think that was an excellent question to end our discussion. And thank you, Adis, very much for your engagement with us. And also we appreciate your struggles and all your works. And, you know, we are great fans of your work, and please keep on doing this amazing and important work. And I really believe that these are the seeds that we plant for the future, for our children and our children's children, you know, in order to, you know, make the world a better place, a more ethical place for all of us to live in. And also thank you everybody for coming to this, spending your afternoon with us. We do have monthly conversations. We have a discussion circle that is monthly. So if you're part of our reading group, if you're part of our newsletter, you'll get information about all our events. So it's very easy to sign up. You just go to Facebook, or to our website. Better to go to our website and you click on the link to join our newsletter, and basically you get all our updates for the events that we have. We're going to have more of these events involving intellectuals, theologians, activists from all around the world, but also from Australia. I think it's fantastic that we have started off here with Adis. So thank you very much for attendance, and I hope to see you at our next event, which is just before Ramadan on the 11th of April, and we'll send you more details on that.
Thank you all, and all the very best
Thank
with your
you.
future work. I tried my best to keep abreast with what's happening, but as you know, it's only 24 hours in the day. And thank you for all you've been doing, and I wish you all the very best, of course. And I'm here to assist in any way I can. But I'm not the only person. There are many, many people out there who are doing fantastic work. And keep tapping into that space.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Salam.
Thank you, Dr. Duderija. Thank you.